The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and it changed everything Bessie Vaughn had ever believed about the safety of home. She had been standing at the dry sink in the back room of the Harrogate boarding house, where she had worked for the past 2 years, scrubbing linens with red and chafed hands, when Mrs. Caldwell pressed the folded yellow paper into her palm without a word. The older woman had a way of delivering bad news with silence, as though the quiet itself were a kind of apology. Bessie unfolded the telegram slowly, the way a person unpeels something they already suspect will sting, and read the short, blunt lines that informed her that her father, Elias Vaughn, had taken ill and that his property in the town of Calico Ridge, Texas, was in danger of being seized. She read it twice. Then she folded it into a small square and pressed it against the front of her apron and stood very still for a moment while the world continued its ordinary turning around her, indifferent to the fact that everything had just shifted. Bessie was 24 years old, and she had not seen her father in nearly 3 years. She had left Calico Ridge not out of bitterness but out of necessity, riding in the back of a merchant's wagon with a carpet-bag and $11, and the stubborn kind of hope that a young woman carries when she has no particular reason to be hopeful, but refuses to stop being so anyway. She had gone to find work to save money to come back one day with enough to help her father clear the debt that had been sitting around his neck like a stone since her mother died and the farm had started failing. That had been the plan, a clean, simple plan, the sort of plan that life has a particular talent for untangling. She packed her bag that evening. Mrs. Caldwell paid her 2 weeks ahead without being asked, which was either generosity or guilt, and Bessie accepted it either way with gratitude and climbed aboard the southbound stage at 5 in the morning with the sky still violet, and the air smelling of horses and iron, and the particular dusty sharpness of a Texas spring, not yet fully arrived. The ride south was long and hard and beautiful in the way that certain difficult things can be beautiful when the light is right and you have the sense to notice. The land opened up in stages, rolling hills giving way to flat expanses where the grass was gold, and the sky went on forever in every direction. She watched it through the small window of the stage and felt the familiar pull of the territory in her chest, something between love and grief, the way she always felt about home. Calico Ridge was a town that had seen better days but was not yet ready to admit it. It sat at the edge of a shallow river bend, population somewhere between 200 and 400, depending on how many drifters had come through that season, with a main street of packed earth and a row of wooden buildings that leaned against each other like tired men at the end of a long day. There was a general store, a post office doubling as a telegraph office, 2 saloons, a church that needed paint, a livery stable, and a small hotel that had never quite finished being built on one end. Bessie knew every inch of it. She had grown up in its dust and played in its alleyways and had her heart broken and mended in its vicinity more times than she cared to count. She climbed down from the stage and stretched her back and looked around the street with the measuring eye of someone returning to a place they have been dreaming about in both good ways and bad. The first person she spoke to was old Clarence at the general store, who told her, with the careful awkwardness of someone who was not sure how much she already knew, that her father was over at the Mercer place being looked after by Widow Mercer, who was a decent enough nurse when she had a mind to be, and that the house and the land had been in some trouble lately on account of the debt that was owed to the bank, which trouble had been made considerably more complicated by the fact that the debt had been sold off. Bessie stopped him there. "Sold off to whom?" she said. Clarence rubbed the back of his neck in the way that men do when they are holding information they are not sure they want to release. "Fella by the name of Harvey Winslow," he said. "Came through here about 6 weeks ago. Bought up the note from the bank. Word is he bought up several of them. He has got a spread about 15 miles east of here, out past the Keller Ridge. Nice enough fella from what I hear, but business is business." Bessie took that in. She thanked Clarence, which took some effort, and went to find her father. Elias Vaughn was 61 years old and looked closer to 75. He was a small, wiry man who had once been strong in the particular way that farming men are strong, but illness had whittled him down, and when Bessie found him propped up in the narrow bed at Widow Mercer's spare room, he looked like a version of her father carved from kindling. His eyes lit up when she came through the door, and whatever complicated feelings she carried about the choices he had made over the years dissolved temporarily in the simple and enormous fact of being glad to see him alive. She sat beside him and held his hand and listened while he told her everything in the stop-and-start way of a man conserving his breath. The debt had grown worse than she had known. He had borrowed against the land twice after she left, first to cover a bad harvest and then to cover the cost of a doctor when he had been sick the previous winter. The original note to the Calico Ridge Savings Bank had been substantial, and the interest had compounded in the way that interest always compounds for men who have no means to outrun it. The total owed was $480. To a woman who had spent 2 years scrubbing linens in a boarding house, $480 was not a small sum, but it was also not an impossible one. She had $320 saved, every dollar of it. 2 years of careful, grinding work, and not spending what she did not have to spend. She had another amount she could raise by selling the few pieces of her mother's jewelry she had taken with her when she left, a gold locket and a pair of small pearl earrings that she had not parted with yet because they were the last physical pieces of her mother she possessed. She had known for a long time that she might have to sell them. The knowing of it had not made it easier to do, but the time for that particular difficulty had apparently arrived. $480 to save the land her father had worked for 30 years. She could do this. She could raise it and she could pay it and she could settle the debt with this Harvey Winslow, whoever he was, and that would be the end of it. She told her father as much, and he shook his head in the stubborn way of a man who did not want to be saved by his own daughter but who had run out of alternatives. "Bessie," he said, "you do not have to do that." "I know I do not have to," she said simply. "That is not the same thing as not doing it." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see that he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the illness and everything to do with the years, and she felt a fierce and complicated love for him that she could not entirely put into words. "The jewelry is in my bag," she said. "I will take it to Rawlings in the morning. He always gave fair prices." Her father closed his eyes and said nothing more, which was its own kind of surrender, and Bessie sat with him until he slept and then went to find herself a place to sleep for the night. The next morning she went to see Rawlings, who ran a small shop of the kind that bought and sold and occasionally fenced things without asking too many questions. He was a fair enough man, if not a generous one, and he offered her $80 for the locket and $30 for the earrings. She held the locket for a long moment in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the particular cool warmth of gold that has been handled for a long time by hands that loved it. Her mother's initials were engraved on the back. MRV Margaret Rose Vaughn, dead 11 years, who had taught Bessie how to make cornbread and how to read and how to hold her head up straight when the world was pushing it down. She set the locket on the counter. "I will take it," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady. $430, $50 short. She sat on the step outside Rawlings's shop and looked at the main street of Calico Ridge in the early morning light and thought about it with the practical clarity that a woman develops when she has been solving problems on her own for long enough. $50. She could earn that. She had earned everything else. But earning it here, in this town, with the debt due and her father ailing and no time to wait, was a different kind of problem. She had 2 pieces of good clothing in her bag, a wool skirt and a decent blouse she had kept for occasions. She could speak and read and write well enough that she could do clerical work if anyone needed it. She was not too proud to ask. But before she started canvassing the town for $50 worth of work, she needed to know exactly where she stood with Harvey Winslow. She needed to know what the terms were, what the timeline was, whether there was any flexibility in either. You did not lay out $430 without first knowing who was receiving them and under what conditions. She asked Clarence for directions to the Winslow spread. He gave them to her with the particular look of a man watching a small woman prepare to walk into a strong wind, which she chose to ignore. The ride out to the Winslow spread took just under 2 hours on the horse she borrowed from the livery, a placid bay gelding named Fletcher who was well suited to the rolling scrubland east of Calico Ridge. The morning had come in warm and bright, the sky a clean washed blue after a night of light rain, and the land smelled of wet grass and cedar, and the particular mineral sharpness of limestone country. Bessie rode it the way she had always ridden, upright and easy in the saddle, watching the land move around her and letting herself feel, despite everything, the simple physical pleasure of being on a horse in Texas in the spring. The Winslow spread appeared first as a line of trees along the ridge, cottonwoods mostly, tall and pale in the morning light, and then as she came over the shallow rise she saw the whole of it laid out below her, and she stopped Fletcher for a moment at the top of the ridge just to look. It was not what she had expected. She had expected, perhaps, something that looked like money, something imposing, deliberately large, the kind of property that announces its owner's ambition from a distance. This was not that. This was a working ranch, honest and well kept, the kind that had been built up carefully over time by someone who understood what they were building. The main house was a solid 2-story structure of whitewashed timber with a covered porch running its full length, not grand but well proportioned and cared for. Behind it were a large barn and 2 smaller outbuildings, all in good repair. The corral held a dozen horses, good-looking animals that moved with the particular economy of livestock that has been well handled. Fields stretched out to the north and east, some planted and some fallow, and the whole property had the look of a place that was doing exactly what a ranch was supposed to do, and doing it without pretension. A man was working at the fence line near the base of the ridge, and as Bessie rode down toward him she was close enough to see that he was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a battered brown hat and a worn canvas jacket, working at a fence post with the steady, unhurried rhythm of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. He had not heard her yet. She rode up to within 20 feet and stopped. "Excuse me," she said. "I am looking for Harvey Winslow." The man turned, and she registered in quick succession that he was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 or 31, with a lean, angular face and dark eyes under the brim of his hat, the kind of face that weather had worked on long enough to settle into something that was not quite handsome in a conventional sense, but that held your attention in a way that conventional handsomeness sometimes does not. He had a straight nose and a jaw that was clean-shaved, and a look about him that was measuring without being unkind, the look of a man who looks at things straight and takes his time forming a judgment. "You found him," he said. His voice was a low, even baritone, unhurried. Bessie looked at him for a moment with the same measuring directness he had given her. "My name is Bessie Vaughn," she said. "Elias Vaughn is my father. I understand you hold the deed to his debt." Something moved across Harvey Winslow's face at her name, something she could not entirely read, somewhere between recognition and surprise, and something else she did not have a name for quite yet. "Miss Vaughn," he said carefully, setting down the fence pliers. "I was not expecting you." "No," she said. "I expect you were not. I have come to pay the debt." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why don't you step down?" he said. "We can talk about it properly." She considered this. "We can talk about it right here." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but the suggestion of one. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "We can, but I am about to offer you coffee, and that offer does not extend to the fence line." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she dismounted. Harvey Winslow had a housekeeper named Dolores, a stout Mexican woman of indeterminate age who moved through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been running a household since before most people could walk. She produced coffee and corn cake in the time it took Bessie to settle into the chair at the kitchen table and take in the room around her, which was clean and spare and functional, the room of a man who lived in his house rather than displaying it. Harvey sat across from her with his hat on the table beside him and his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and looked at her with that steady, direct gaze that she was already finding both useful and slightly unnerving. "I bought the note from the Calico Ridge Bank 6 weeks ago," he said, without preamble, which she appreciated. "Your father's debt, along with 3 others in the county. I am not a speculator, Miss Vaughn. I'm not buying up notes to foreclose on people and take their land. I bought them because the bank was in trouble and selling them at a discount, and I had the capital to buy them, and I intended to work out reasonable arrangements with the debtors." He paused. "I had heard your father was ill. I had not rushed him for anything." Bessie looked at him over her coffee cup. "That is good to hear," she said, "but I have not come to make arrangements. I have come to pay it." "The full amount," he said. "The full amount," she said, "or as close as I can come to it today. I am $50 short, which I can make up within a reasonable time." Something in his expression shifted subtly, something she thought might be respect, or at least the beginning of it. He studied her for a moment. "How do you intend to make up the $50? "That is my concern," she said, and said it pleasantly enough that the sharpness in it was only barely noticeable. He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man thinking something through, and Bessie watched him think it through and waited. "Miss Vaughn," he said at last, "I'm going to say something, and I ask you to hear it out before you respond." She lifted her chin slightly. "Say it." "I have got a ranch here that runs about 400 acres, with 12 horses and 100 and some head of cattle. I have got dolers here, and 2 hands who come in for seasonal work, and a problem." He paused. "I do not have anyone to keep records. I have been doing my own accounting for 3 years, and I am a fair enough rancher, but I am not a bookkeeper. And last season I missed 2 bills from the feed supplier that cost me more than they should have because nobody was watching the numbers. I need someone who can read and write and add and who is not afraid of work. I will pay $7 a week." Bessie looked at him. "You are offering me a job." "I am," he said. $7 a week is $30 a month. In 2 months you would have your $50 and more besides. You could stay in the spare room here, which is decent enough. Dolers would tell you the same." He looked at her steadily. "I am not offering you charity. I am offering you an employment arrangement that would serve both of us. But if you would rather find your $50 some other way, that is entirely your right, and I will say nothing more about it." Bessie set her coffee cup down and looked at this man across the table from her, this Harvey Winslow who had bought her father's debt without knowing she would come to pay it herself, and who was now sitting across from her in his working clothes with a face as straight and open as the country he lived in, making her a reasonable proposal in a reasonable voice, and she was aware of a number of things simultaneously. She was aware that this was a sensible solution to a practical problem. She was aware that she did not entirely know what she was walking into. She was aware that there was something in the particular quality of his attention, the way he looked at her, that was doing something to her composure that she could not entirely account for and did not entirely want to examine just yet. "I will need to be able to see my father regularly," she said. 15 miles is a long day," he said, "but not an impossible one. On your days off, you could go into town. I will need it understood that the employment arrangement and the debt are separate. I am paying the debt in full, and then I am earning wages for work, not working off a debt." "Understood entirely," he said. "The debt is a separate matter. I will draw up a receipt today for the amount you have brought. The remaining 50 will be noted as payable at your convenience." "At my convenience," she repeated, and the firmness in her voice was not quite a challenge, but it was not far from one either. "At your convenience," he agreed, and this time the smile did come, and it changed his face in a way she was not prepared for, opening something up in it that had not been there before, something warmer and less guarded and considerably more dangerous to her concentration. She looked at her coffee cup. "I will take the job," she said. She rode back to town to collect her things and visit her father and arrange for the payment of the $380 she was delivering that day, which left her $50 short as she had said. And when she came back in the late afternoon with her carpetbag and her horse and the official receipt from Harvey Winslow, Dolers showed her to the spare room upstairs, which was small and clean and had a window that looked out over the eastern fields. And Bessie Vaughn stood at that window for a long time in the early evening light and looked out over the land and thought about where she was and how she had come to be there, and told herself firmly and clearly that she was here to do a job and nothing else. She very nearly believed it. The work Harvey had described was real work, which was the first thing she discovered, and she was glad of it. She had never been good at being idle, and keeping books for a working ranch turned out to require a particular kind of attentiveness that she found genuinely absorbing. She set up a proper ledger in the small room off the kitchen that Harvey used as an office, which was a generous name for a space that was mostly a desk buried under 3 years of loose papers, and receipts written on everything from invoice sheets to the backs of flour sacks. She spent the first 2 days simply sorting and organizing, working through the accumulated evidence of a ranch being run by a man who was very good at ranching and merely adequate at paperwork. And she found in the process that she could reconstruct the rough financial history of the Winslow spread with reasonable accuracy, and that it was, despite the bookkeeping chaos, a genuinely healthy operation. Harvey appeared in the doorway of the office on the afternoon of the second day to find her cross-legged on the floor with a year's worth of receipts sorted into piles around her, and he stood there for a moment without saying anything, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man confronted with evidence that the person he hired was considerably more capable than he had expected. "You found the Hargreaves receipts," he said, noting the particular pile she was studying. "These are not organized by date or by vendor," she said, looking up at him. "They appear to be organized by some system I have not yet understood, or by no system at all." "No system at all is closer to the truth," he said, and the rueful quality in his voice made her want to smile. "I found 6 that were duplicated," she said. "You paid for the same delivery twice on at least 3 occasions. That is $17 you should not have spent." He looked at her. Something moved in his face. "I can credit that toward the balance," he said. She shook her head. "That is a separate matter. This is about your accounts, which is what you hired me for." She looked down at the papers. "You also have an outstanding receivable from a man named Patterson who bought 2 horses from you in November and paid only half. That is $35 outstanding." Harvey was quiet for a moment. "I had forgotten about Patterson," he said. "You have a lot of horses," she said. "It is possible things fall through the cracks." He leaned against the door frame and looked at her with an expression she could not quite categorize, something attentive and a little bit wondering, like a man watching something he had expected to be one thing turn out to be another. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. She glanced up at him briefly. "My mother taught me numbers. I taught myself the rest." She paused. "There was a man at the boarding house in Harrogate who kept accounts for a timber company. I watched him work for 2 years and read his books when he left them out." She said it matter-of-factly, because it was matter-of-fact, because she had never had the luxury of formal education and had gotten everything she knew from watching and reading and doing, and she was not particularly embarrassed about that and did not expect other people to be either. Harvey Winslow looked at her for another moment. "Dolers says dinner is at 6, he said, and pushed off from the doorway, and she heard him walk back down the hall, and she sat in the middle of her receipts and looked at the place where he had been standing and told herself again, with some firmness, that she was here to do a job. The evenings at the Winslow spread had a particular quality that Bessie had not anticipated. After dinner, which Dolers produced with the same undemonstrative competence she brought to everything, Harvey would often sit at the table with a cup of coffee and whatever he was reading, and sometimes Bessie would be there too, working on the ledger or reading herself, and they would share the comfortable silence of 2 people who were not made uncomfortable by silence. She had not expected that. She had expected a certain awkwardness, the particular strain of two relative strangers sharing a domestic space under undefined terms. But the awkwardness, while it existed in some form, was not the dominant quality of the evenings. The dominant quality was something closer to ease, which she found both pleasant and, in certain moments, faintly alarming. He was a reader, which surprised her the first time she noticed his shelf of books, a real collection of them, not for show but for use, the spines cracked and the pages marked, Twain and a volume of Dickens and several histories, and a worn copy of something in Spanish that she guessed was Dolar's influence. He had a quiet intelligence about him that emerged not in large declarations, but in the quality of his questions and the care with which he listened to the answers. And she found herself talking to him in the evenings more than she had expected to, about the accounts first and then about wider things, about the territory and the land, and the way the cattle business was changing as the railheads moved north and the fencing pushed in from the east. He told her one evening about 2 weeks in that he had come to Texas from Missouri when he was 22, with $100 and a letter of introduction to a rancher who had known his father. "Your father was a rancher?" she asked. "No," he said, "a school teacher. He never owned land in his life, but he read everything and he knew everyone worth knowing, and the letter was more valuable than the $100. He looked down at his coffee cup. He died the year before I came out here. I think he would have liked this country." Bessie looked at him. "My mother would have liked it too," she said. "She was from the hill country originally, east of here. She always said flat land was wasted country. She wanted horizon in every direction." Harvey looked up at her, and there was a warmth in his expression that was different from his usual steadiness, something more personal, more open. "How long has she been gone?" he said. 11 years, Bessie said. "I was 13. He nodded slowly. He did not say anything more, which was exactly right because he understood, she thought, that there was nothing to say that would improve on just acknowledging it. The days built a rhythm. She worked through the morning on the accounts, which grew cleaner and more organized with each passing day. She helped Dolars with the kitchen work in the afternoons, which Dolars accepted with a kind of reserved pleasure, showing Bessie the particular ways she did things, the cast iron seasoning, and the way to do bread in the Dutch oven, and the specific temperature at which the coffee was best. Harvey was outside most of the day with the horses and the cattle and the hands, coming in for meals with the smell of livestock and open air on him, and there were hours of each day when she did not see him at all. But she was aware of him with a consistency that she found increasingly difficult to dismiss as professional attentiveness. She was aware of the sound of his boots on the porch in the evening. She was aware of the way he looked at her across the dinner table, not with anything she could call inappropriate, but with a steady, thoughtful quality that made her feel seen in a way she was not entirely accustomed to, and that she was not entirely sure she knew what to do with. She was aware, when she rode out to check on her father twice that first week, that the stretch of time away from the ranch felt different than she expected, that there was something she was riding toward when she came back as much as something she was returning from. Her father was improving slowly, which was the best news of her days. Widow Mercer was a competent woman who took good practical care of him, and Elias Vaughn had enough stubbornness in him to serve as a survival strategy on its own. He asked about the Winslow spread on each of her visits with the careful, sideways interest of a man who does not want to ask the questions he is most interested in. "This Winslow," he said on her second visit, "he treats you fairly." "He does," she said honestly, "and the work is proper work, not servant's work. It is bookkeeping," she said, "which you know I am good at." Her father was quiet for a moment. "Is he a decent man?" he said. She thought about Harvey Winslow across the dinner table with his book and his coffee. She thought about the way he had laid out the employment offer with complete clarity and let her make her own decision without pressure. She thought about the receipt he had written out with his own hand and the way he had said, "At your convenience." "Yes," she said, I think he is. Her father made a non-committal sound, which, from Elias Vaughn, was approximately the equivalent of considerable approval. The thing that began to change between them was gradual and then, at some point that she could not quite locate in time, not gradual at all. It started, she thought later, with the horses. She had grown up around horses and she knew them, not in the way that Harvey knew them, which was the deep, technical knowledge of a man who had been working with horses seriously for years, but in the way of someone who had always had a natural feeling for them. She had noticed his horses from the first day, the quality of them, and one evening about 3 weeks in she was leaning on the corral fence in the last of the day's light, watching a young paint mare who was new to the herd and was still working out her place in it. And Harvey came up beside her and leaned on the fence beside her without saying anything for a while, and they both just watched the mare. "She is going to be something," Bessie said eventually. "She already is," he said. "She is just not sure of it yet." They stood there in the cooling evening air, and the paint mare moved around the corral with her high-headed wariness and her beautiful, uncertain grace. And Bessie was aware of the space between her and Harvey contracting slightly as he shifted his weight, or she shifted hers, and she was aware of the warmth of him beside her and the particular quality of the silence between them, which was no longer the easy, comfortable silence of two people sharing a domestic space, but something more charged and more complicated and more honest. "Miss Vaughn," he said, and stopped. She looked at him. He was looking at the horse, and there was something working in his face that she recognized as a man preparing himself to say something he had thought about for a while. "I think you should call me Bessie," she said, before he could continue. He looked at her then, and whatever he had been about to say rearranged itself into something else, and the look on his face was a look she was going to remember for a very long time. "Harvey," he said. "I know," she said, and felt her face doing something she could not entirely control. They stood at the fence for another 20 minutes without saying anything else of significance, and when Bessie went inside, she went directly to the small mirror above the washstand in her room and looked at herself honestly and said out loud, to the woman in the mirror, "Well." The woman in the mirror looked back at her without any particular sympathy. The following Sunday she rode into town and brought her father the fresh bread Dolers had sent and sat with him in the afternoon light, and told him, in the broad strokes, that she expected to have the remaining $50 by the end of the following month, and that she was well and the work was good, and the ranch was a sound operation. Her father listened to all of this and then said, "You are different." "I am not different," she said. "You are," he said. "You have got color in your face that was not there before, or maybe it was always there and you are just not hiding it as much." She chose not to address this directly and asked him instead how his appetite was, which he took as confirmation of whatever theory he was forming, and which she chose to ignore. On her way back through town, she stopped at the post office to check whether there was any mail for her father, and she ran into a woman named Clara Hobbs, who was about her own age and had been at school with her years ago, and who pressed her for information about where she was staying and who she was working for, and who received the information about the Winslow Ranch with the particular bright-eyed interest of a woman who has been in a small town long enough to treat other people's stories as her primary entertainment. "Harvey Winslow," Clara said, with a quality in her voice that made Bessie look at her. "He needed a bookkeeper," Bessie said. "He is very well regarded," Clara said. "Very," she paused. "He was at the spring dance last year. He danced with nearly everyone. He is very polite." "He seems so," Bessie said, with a carefulness in her voice that she recognized was not as neutral as she intended. Clara looked at her with the sharp-eyed intelligence of a woman who has heard everything that was not said. "He is not spoken for," she said, and then looked pleased with herself for having said it. Bessie bought a small bag of horehound candy at the general store for her father, and rode back to the ranch in the golden late afternoon, and spent the ride thinking about a considerable variety of things that she was not ready to think about clearly, and then arriving at the ranch, and finding Harvey in the yard with one of the horses, and thinking about all of them anyway. The moment that clarified things happened in the third week of May. One of the horses, a young gray gelding that Harvey had been working with, had gotten out of the corral in the night and found a tangle of wire from an old fence line in the east pasture and come back with a leg cut that needed attention. Harvey was with him when Bessie came out in the early morning to find half the ranch in motion, and she came to the corral gate and looked in and saw Harvey on his knees in the dirt beside the horse, talking to him in a low, steady voice while he examined the cut, and the horse was trembling and rolling his eye white, and Harvey was just very quiet and very steady. And after a minute the horse put his head down and the trembling stopped. She watched him work on the wound with the same thoroughness and patience he brought to everything, and after some time he looked up and saw her at the gate and said, "The wire did not go deep. He will be all right." "I know," she said. "I could see it from here." He looked at her across the corral, kneeling in the dirt with the horse's leg in his hands and the morning light coming in low and gold from the east, and he smiled, a real one, not the barely there one she had catalogued before, but a wide, open, honest smile that transformed his face in a way that did something considerable to her heartbeat. "You want to help me clean this up," he said. "Hand me the carbolic," she said, and stepped into the corral, and they worked side by side on that horse for the better part of an hour, and when the gelding was cleaned and bandaged and settled, Harvey sat back on his heels in the dirt and looked at her with that open, warm look that had been becoming more frequent. And she was sitting beside him in the dirt with her skirt thoroughly ruined and her hands smelling of carbolic acid, and she felt happier than she had felt in a very long time. "Bessie," he said. "Harvey," she said, and she said it with the quality of a woman who is daring herself. He looked at her for a long moment and then he said quietly and directly, "I would like very much to take you into town on Saturday evening if you are willing. There is a social at the church." She looked at him. "You are asking to take me to a church social." "I am asking to take you to a church social," he said, absolutely steady. She considered this for a moment. "All right," she said. He nodded. He did not look away. "All right," he said. They sat there for a moment longer in the dirt of the corral, which was an unconventional location for the beginning of a courtship. And then they both stood up, and Bessie went back to the house to change her skirt, and she moved through the kitchen with a lightness in her step that did not go unnoticed by dolers, who said nothing, but who smiled at the bread she was kneading with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with the bread. The church social on Saturday evening was well attended, which meant that Bessie arrived with Harvey Winslow to the combined attention of roughly half of Calico Ridge's social population. And she was not a woman who was easily made self-conscious, but she felt the attention with particular vividness. Harvey was a composed man in public, polite and easy with people, shaking hands and exchanging words with several of the men she did not know and greeting the ones she did with the directness that was his habitual manner. And he stayed close to her side without being awkward about it, and introduced her to people with a simple formality that assumed she was worth being introduced to. She was aware of Clara Hobbs watching her from across the room with a look of supreme satisfaction, as though a prediction she had made to herself had proven correct exactly on schedule. Harvey asked her to dance, which she had half expected and had been thinking about, and when they danced she discovered that he was better at it than she would have predicted, with the same quality in his movement that he had with horses, a kind of easy, unhurried steadiness that made it simple to follow him. And they danced twice and then stood at the edge of the room with lemonade in the warm evening air and talked about nothing in particular. And she thought, "This is a man I could love," and the thought arrived with such calm conviction that she was not even startled by it. He drove her back to the ranch in the wagon under a sky that was brilliant with stars, the kind of sky that only exists in the Texas high country on a clear night, where the Milky Way is an actual white river overhead and the darkness between the stars has depth to it. They rode in a companionable quiet for a while, and then he said, not looking at her, looking at the road ahead, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. "Tell me." "When I bought the notes from the bank," he said, "I had not thought about what I would do if the debtors came to pay them. I had thought about working out arrangements, extending time, maybe some kind of exchange of labor. I had not thought beyond that." He paused. "And then you rode up to my fence line and told me you had come to pay your father's debt, and I thought—" He stopped. "What did you think?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily down the dark road, and the stars burned overhead, and the cedar smell of the night was all around them. "I thought," he said, "that I was glad you had come." She looked at his profile, the clean line of his jaw against the star-bright sky, and she felt the warmth of him beside her on the wagon seat and said, quietly, "I was not expecting to be glad of it myself." He turned to look at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything more. But something had been named that had not been named before, and the space between them on the wagon seat was a different kind of space after that. When they pulled up to the ranch and Harvey handed her down from the wagon, he held her hand a moment longer than was strictly necessary to accomplish the task, and she let him. And then she went inside and stood in the kitchen in the dark and felt the warmth in her hand where his had been. The weeks that followed had a sweetness to them that Bessie had not expected to find here, in this unlikely place, under these unlikely circumstances. Harvey courted her with the same thoroughness and patience he brought to everything, which meant that it was unhurried and genuine, and conducted with a seriousness that she found far more compelling than any amount of dramatic gesture would have been. He brought her flowers once, which he did with a self-consciousness that was so different from his usual manner that she had to look at her ledger to hide her smile. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons, showing her the ranch in detail, pointing out the various pastures and the water sources, and telling her the history of how the land had been built up, with the quiet pride of a man who has made something real. He asked her about herself with the attention of someone who is listening to the answers, and she told him things she had not told many people, about her mother and about the years after, about the particular quality of her leaving when she left for Harrogate, the mix of necessity and escape in it, and the way she had never entirely resolved the guilt of leaving her father even when she knew leaving was the right thing. "You came back," Harvey said. "When it mattered, you came back." "It should not have taken a telegram," she said. "Maybe not," he said, "but you came. And you came ready to solve the problem. There is not many people who would have done it the way you did." She looked at him. "How did I do it?" "On your own," he said. "With your own money and your own plan before you even knew what the situation was exactly. You did not wait to be rescued. You rode in to do the rescuing yourself." He looked at her with a directness that made her chest tighten pleasantly. "I find that considerably admirable, Bessie." It was the first time he had said her name with that particular quality, a softness in it that was different from his usual even way of addressing her, and she felt it somewhere in the vicinity of her heart. "You are a strange man to be holding someone's debt," she said after a moment. He looked at her. "How so?" "Most men in your position would have used it as leverage," she said, "not offered employment." He was quiet for a moment. "It would not have been right to use it as leverage," he said simply, and that was apparently the totality of his thinking on the matter, the bedrock simplicity of it, and she recognized in that moment something that she had been circling around for weeks, which was that this was a fundamentally good man, not good in an uncomplicated way, not without flaws or edges, but good in the manner that matters, in the manner of a man who knows what is right and does it without needing to make a performance of it. Her $50 came together at the end of the 6th week. She had been saving $7 per week, and between the wages and the small extra amount she had earned helping Widow Mercer with correspondence, she counted it out on the last day of May and brought it to Harvey in the office with the same directness with which she had delivered everything, setting it on the desk in front of him. $50, she said. "The balance." He looked at the money and then at her. "You did not have to do it all at once," he said. "I know," she said, "but I wanted it done." He looked at her for a moment, and then he reached into the desk drawer and produced the note, the original document, the deed to her father's debt, and he put it on the desk and wrote "paid in full" across the face of it in his clear, even hand and dated it and signed it and slid it across to her. She picked it up. She looked at it. She thought about her father in the narrow bed at Widow Mercer's, and her mother's gold locket in Rawlings's case, and the 2 years of scrubbing linens and saving every dollar, and the morning she had ridden up to Harvey Winslow's fence line with her heart in her throat and her chin in the air, not knowing what she was walking into. "Thank you," she said. "You earned it," he said simply. She folded the document carefully and put it in her pocket, and then she looked at him and said, "I would like to keep working here." Something shifted in his face. "The accounts," he said. "The accounts," she agreed, "and other reasons." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood up from the desk. And he was tall, she thought, not for the first time, taller than he seemed when you were not standing directly in front of him. And he looked at her with that steadiness that she had come to understand was not distance but rather its opposite, the steadiness of a man who feels things deeply and holds himself still around them. "Bessie," he said. "Harvey," she said. "I have been wanting to say something to you for a considerable while," he said. "Then say it," she said, and her voice was steady, which she was proud of. "I think I am in love with you," he said. Not performing it, not building to it, just saying it with the directness of a man who has finished deliberating and arrived at a conclusion. "I know it has been 6 weeks and you came here under circumstances that were not exactly, he stopped. I want you to know that what I feel is not about the circumstances. It is about you, the person you are. I think you are the most." He stopped again. "I am better with horses than with speeches," he said. She felt something warm and luminous expanding in her chest. "You are doing fine," she said. "I think you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met," he said, and said it straight, without any of the awkwardness of the previous sentences, and she could see that he meant it exactly as he said it, without qualification or hedging. She crossed the small office and stood in front of him and looked up at him and said, "I have been in love with you for at least 3 weeks, and I have been arguing with myself about it for all 3 of them." He looked at her for a moment, and then he reached out and took her face in his hands very gently, with the same careful steadiness with which he handled the horses he loved, and he kissed her. It was a quiet kiss, unhurried, honest, the kind of kiss that does not try to be more than it is and is therefore everything. When they separated, dolers could be heard from the kitchen making considerably more noise with the pots than was strictly required by the cooking activity currently underway, which suggested strongly that the walls of the Winslow ranch were not particularly effective at containing information. Harvey looked down at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, an openness that was almost boyish, a warmth and a happiness that sat there without any of his habitual restraint, and she thought she had never seen a face that she wanted to look at more. "I should tell my father," she said. "I should ask your father," he said. She looked at him. "Ask him what?" "The proper thing," he said, and the slight gravity with which he said it, the old-fashioned, serious correctness of it, made her feel something she had no adequate word for, something that was half laughter and entirely love. "He is going to be insufferable about having been right," she said. Harvey smiled. "I can survive that," he said. They went to see Bessie Vaughn on a Thursday afternoon, riding in together, which was in itself a declaration that the whole of Calico Ridge's Main Street observed and noted with interest. Harvey sat with her father in the front room of the Mercer place while Bessie sat in the next room, and listened to the murmur of their voices without being able to make out words, which was approximately as comfortable as she had expected it to be. After about 20 minutes Harvey appeared in the doorway and said, "Your father would like to speak with you." She went in. Her father was sitting up in the chair by the window, which was an improvement from the bed, and he looked at her with the particular quality of a man who has been proved right and is trying very hard not to look as pleased about it as he is. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "He is a good man," her father said. "I told him as much." "That is generous of you," she said, "given that he bought your debt." He bought it to protect it, her father said with a calm certainty that surprised her. He told me that. He said the bank was in trouble, and if anyone else had bought those notes, they might not have been as patient. He told me he had intended from the start to work something fair out. Paused. I believe him. Bessie looked at her father in the afternoon light, this small, worn, stubborn man she loved, and felt the weight of the years between them, all the complicated, imperfect love of a father and daughter who had each been doing their best under difficult circumstances. I believe him too, she said. Her father nodded. He reached out and took her hand, and they sat like that for a moment, and then he said, "Your mother would have liked him." She had to look out the window for a moment. She would, she said. She would have given him a very hard time just to make sure he meant it, and then she would have liked him enormously. Her father laughed, which was a sound she had not heard in a long time, and it was a very good sound. The summer of 1882 passed in a kind of golden abundance that Bessie would remember for the rest of her life. She kept the books for the Winslow Ranch with a thoroughness that transformed them from a source of financial anxiety to a genuine asset, tracking the cattle sales and the horse trades and the feed accounts, and the wages with a precision that had Harvey saying, on more than one occasion, that he did not know how he had managed before her, which she took as the practical compliment she suspected it was intended to be, and the warmer kind besides. She and Harvey moved through their days with the easy intimacy of two people who have decided on each other and are discovering what that looks like in the particulars of daily life. He was a straightforward man to be in love with, she found. He said what he meant. He did not manufacture complications. He was patient in the ways she needed patience and direct in the ways she needed directness. And he listened to her opinions on the ranch operations with a genuine interest that she had not always expected to find, because she had not always found it. He came to her one August morning with a look on his face that she had learned to recognize as the face of a man who has decided to do something and is working up to the doing of it, and she waited for him over breakfast while he arranged his thoughts, which took long enough that Dolores appeared twice in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a woman wondering what was taking so long. "I was wondering," Harvey said at last, "if you might consider marrying me." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "Were you wondering that?" she said. "I have been wondering it for about a month," he said. "I thought I should ask directly." "You always do things directly," she said. "I try to," he said, and he was looking at her with the full force of that steady, deep, open attention, and she felt it as she always felt it, warm and certain and entirely like home. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Harvey Winslow." He exhaled, which told her that whatever certainty he projected, there had been some part of him that was not entirely sure of the answer. And she found that knowledge, that he had not been entirely sure, that she still had the power to make him uncertain, to be one of the most touching things she had ever discovered about anyone. Dolores' response to the news was to begin immediately planning a celebratory meal of such ambition that it occupied her completely for the rest of the day, which Harvey and Bessie took as permission to go for a long ride together through the eastern pastures in the warm August afternoon, riding side by side through the tall grass and the cedar brakes, talking about things and not talking about things. And Bessie looked at the land around her and felt it in a way she had not let herself feel it before. As hers in some way, as home in a way that required her commitment, and she gave that commitment quietly and entirely as they rode. Her father recovered enough by September to be moved back to his own house, which the $50 from Bessie's wages, combined with the assistance of two of Harvey's hands who went over on a Saturday and spent the day on the roof and the fence, had put in considerably better condition than it had been. Harvey had arranged it without making a production of it, simply mentioning that the hands were coming and that it would be good to get the work done before the weather turned. Bessie Vaughn accepted the help with the dignity of a man who has gotten past the point where pride is more important than a sound roof, which took some doing, and which Bessie appreciated enormously. The wedding was in October. in the church at Calico Ridge, which had received a fresh coat of paint by that time, the congregation having decided in the summer that the building had gone unattended long enough. Bessie wore a dress that Dollars had helped her make, a deep blue wool that was the finest dress she had ever owned, and she stood at the front of that church beside Harvey Winslow and spoke her vows with the same directness and steadiness with which she did everything, and felt the rightness of it in every part of her. Her father walked her down the aisle on a cane but with his chin up, and when he put her hand in Harvey's and stepped back, the look on his face was a thing she carried with her for the rest of her life. Clara Hobbs cried openly from the third pew, which she later defended on the grounds that she had seen it coming from the beginning and was therefore entitled. The winter of 1882 settled over the Winslow ranch with the comfortable weight of a good quilt. The house felt different to Bessie now, not as a place she was staying but as a place she inhabited, and the difference was everything. She rearranged certain things in the kitchen with Dollars' blessing and put curtains in the front room that Harvey looked at with the expression of a man who is not sure about curtains, but is sure enough about the woman who put them there to keep his opinion to himself. She planted a small kitchen garden in the sheltered corner of the yard that Dollars had always wanted, but never had the help to maintain, and they planned the spring planting together over the kitchen table, with the shared enthusiasm of women who understand that growing things is a form of optimism. Harvey was a husband of the same quality he was everything else, which was to say attentive and consistent and fundamentally good. He was not a man of elaborate romantic gestures, but he was a man who noticed things, who brought her wildflowers when he passed them on the range without making a ceremony of it, who remembered that she liked her coffee dark and her cornbread without much sugar, and that she slept better with the window cracked even in cold weather. He was a man who looked at her across a room with the full warmth of what he felt without needing to perform it, and she found that this was worth more than any amount of performance. Bessie Vaughn came to Sunday dinner regularly through the winter, making the 15-mile ride himself on the good horse Harvey had quietly arranged for him to have access to, and the dinners were loud and warm and full of the particular pleasure of a table that has enough people at it. Her father and Harvey had developed a friendship that she had not entirely anticipated, a mutual respect grounded in their shared appreciation of practical things, of land and horses, and the particular discipline of making something work. And she loved watching them together in the way that you love watching two people you love appreciate each other. In the spring of 1883, Bessie discovered she was expecting a child. She told Harvey on an evening in April, sitting on the porch in the mild dark, the stars beginning to appear, and she watched his face as she told him, and what she saw there was something she would never forget. The complete, uncomplicated, overwhelming joy of it. No hesitation, no complication, just the pure and immediate happiness of a man hearing the best news of his life. He held her hands for a long time without saying anything, just looking at her, and then he said, "Bessie." "Harvey," she said. "That is the most wonderful thing I have ever heard," he said. "You need to expand your vocabulary," she said, "because you are going to need more words than that." He laughed. He pulled her into his side and held her there in the cool spring evening, and she leaned against the solid warmth of him and listened to the night sounds of the ranch, the horses in the corral and the insects in the grass and the distant call of something out in the dark, and felt a completeness that she had not known she was building toward but that had been under construction, she thought. Since the moment she had ridden up to a fence line in the spring of 1882 with $430 in her bag and a jaw set like ironwood. Their son was born in December of 1883, a large, healthy boy with Harvey's dark eyes and Bessie's stubbornness, which manifested itself from approximately the second week of his existence and never entirely went away. They named him James Winslow, James for Harvey's father, the schoolteacher, Elias for the grandfather who came to see him for the first time and sat holding him in the chair by the window with the expression of a man who has been given more than he expected from this life. Dolores was beside herself with satisfaction and produced an extraordinary amount of food to celebrate. And the Winslow Ranch in the winter of 1883 was full of light and warmth, and the very particular noise of a family that has found its shape. Harvey came to her one evening when the baby was about 3 weeks old and she was nursing him in the rocking chair by the fire, and he sat down on the footstool nearby and watched them with an expression of such open, unguarded love that she felt it like a physical thing. "I keep thinking," he said quietly, "about what would have happened if you had not come." "You would have had a very clean set of accounts," she said. "I would have had nobody to teach me that Patterson owed me $35, he said. She laughed softly, which woke the baby briefly and then did not, which was a small miracle. "I keep thinking," Harvey continued, "that I bought that note without any thought of you. I did not know you existed, and you had no idea I existed, and somehow," he paused, "here we are." She looked at him in the firelight, this man she had loved for a year and a half now, this steady, honest, good-hearted man who had offered her a job from his knees in the dirt of a corral, and danced with her at a church social and asked for her hand over morning coffee, with the directness of a man who has run out of reasons to wait. "Here we are," she agreed. He reached out and put his hand very lightly on the baby's head, and the baby made the small, soft sound of a creature completely at peace, and Bessie looked at the two of them in the firelight and felt something enormous and quiet settle over her, the specific gravity of a life that has been built rather than happened into, of a happiness that has been worked for and earned and arrived at honestly. The year 1884 brought changes to Calico Ridge and the surrounding territory, as years in Texas in that decade invariably did. The cattle trails were shifting as the railheads moved, and the fencing that everyone had opinions about continued its slow march across the open range, changing the nature of ranching in ways that required constant adaptation. Harvey navigated it with the same pragmatism he brought to everything, reading the market and adjusting his operation, making the transition from open range to closed range ranching earlier than many of his neighbors, which required investment but which positioned him well as the decade advanced. Bessie's role in the ranch had expanded by then well beyond bookkeeping. She was, in the practical language of the territory, a working partner in the operation, knowing the accounts and the land and the operation as thoroughly as Harvey knew them, and they made decisions together over the kitchen table, with the ledgers open between them and the coffee hot, and Elias James asleep in his cradle nearby. And the rightness of it was something Harvey said often, and she felt always. Her father's health held through 1884, better than any of them had expected, the illness that had brought her back receding to a manageable condition with rest and good food, and the stubborn refusal of Bessie Vaughn to be an invalid. He sold the farm at the end of that year, which was a decision he came to slowly and on his own terms, and which brought him enough to live comfortably, and he moved into a small house in Calico Ridge near Widow Mercer's, which was a proximity that Bessie noted with interest, and which her father declined to comment on, and which resulted, by the following spring, in a very quiet marriage between two people who had been adjacent to happiness long enough to finally walk into it. Bessie discovered she was expecting again in the summer of 1885, and this time the news landed in the household with the particular warmth of a second abundance, a richness they had not taken for granted the first time and did not take for granted now. Harvey received the news in the same unguarded way he had received the first, with the same immediacy of joy that she had never stopped being grateful for, and Dolores, who had been with them now for 4 years and showed no signs of leaving, responded by beginning to rearrange the upstairs bedroom arrangements in the way of a woman who has already decided where the second child will sleep and is simply waiting for the rest of the household to catch up. Their daughter was born in February of 1886, pink and fierce and opinionated from her first breath, with Bessie's green eyes and Harvey's dark hair, and they named her Margaret Rose Winslow, which meant something to everyone who knew the story. Harvey held his daughter for the first time in the gray February morning and looked at her with an expression that was beyond his usual vocabulary, a softness and a depth that Bessie watched from the bed and carried inside her as one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. "Margaret," he said, very softly. "She would have liked your name," Bessie said. "My mother, she would have said it suits you." He looked up at her. "Your mother would have had me well evaluated within the first 10 minutes," he said. 5, she said. She was efficient. He smiled, and the baby made a sound, and he looked back down at her with an attention so complete and so loving that Bessie felt her eyes sting with it, the good kind. The spring of 1886 came in warm and green, better rain than the previous 2 years, and the Winslow Ranch showed it in the way that good land shows good weather, with a richness and a fullness that felt like reward for the work of the hard years. The cattle were doing well, and the horses were doing better, and the accounts, which Bessie kept in her clean, precise hand in the ledger on the office shelf, showed a solid operation trending in the right direction, which was the direction that Harvey and Bessie Winslow intended to keep it going for a very long time. On a morning in late April, Bessie walked out to the east pasture fence where Harvey was working, as she had walked out many mornings over the past 4 years, and she leaned on the fence beside him, and they both looked out over the land in the morning light, the grass green from the spring rain, the sky beginning its long, clear blue arc toward noon, the horses moving in the lower pasture with their beautiful, purposeful ease. "I have been thinking," she said. "When are you not?" he said, and it was fond, completely fond, the way you say something to a person whose constant thinking you have long since stopped trying to compete with and have learned instead to admire. "I have been thinking about the Patterson pasture," she said. "The 40 acres to the north, he is selling it. I saw the notice when I was in town." She paused. "It would give us water access to the second spring. In a dry year that matters considerably." Harvey looked at her sideways. The morning light was on his face, the face she had been watching for 4 years now, weathered and steady and entirely her favorite face in the world. "You have already done the numbers," he said. "Obviously," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land. "What do the numbers say?" he said. "They say we can do it," she said, "if we are careful." "When are we not?" he said, using her own formulation back at her, and she felt the warmth of it, the familiar particular warmth of a joke that belongs entirely to 2 people, the private language of a life built together. "Then we should do it," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The sun was warm on her face, and the land was green, and the horses were moving in the lower pasture, and somewhere behind them in the house she could hear dolers beginning the morning with the sounds that meant breakfast was coming, and Elias James was awake, and Margaret would be wanting attention, the full, warm, particular sounds of a life that was full. "Harvey," she said. "Bessie," he said. She reached out and took his hand on the fence rail, not because it needed to be done for any practical purpose, but because it was there and she wanted to, and his hand wrapped around hers with the steady, certain warmth of a man who has never once since the beginning of this made her feel anything other than exactly where she was supposed to be. She thought about the telegram on a Tuesday morning in a boarding house, and the stage south, and the ride out through cedar and limestone to a fence line where a man had been working in the spring light with no idea that she was coming. She thought about the receipt written out in a clear, even hand, and the employment offer made from an honest and sensible place, and the paint mare in the corral in the evening light, and a church social under a sky full of stars. She thought about her mother's locket, which she had bought back from Rawlings in December of 1882 with the first solid wages she had earned, which Harvey had handed her the money for without saying anything about it beyond that she should get it, and that it should be hers again, and which now hung at her throat above the blue wool dress that was now her Sunday dress, MRV worn warm against her skin every day. She thought about all of it with the particular kind of gratitude that is not quite the same as happiness, but that sits beneath happiness, holding it up, the gratitude of a person who knows what it cost to get here and therefore knows what it is worth. The land rolled away before them in the spring morning, green and vast in theirs, and the sky above it was the blue that only exists in Texas in April, and Harvey's hand was warm around hers, and somewhere behind them in the house Elia's James Winslow was probably getting into something he should not be in, and Margaret Rose Winslow was probably telling someone about it in the imperious way she had developed already at 2 months old. And Dolers was making coffee and cornbread, and the horses were moving in the lower pasture with their heads up in the morning air. "We should go in," Bessie said. "In a minute," Harvey said. They stood at the fence for another minute and looked at their land in the spring light and held hands and did not say anything, because there was not anything left to say that the morning was not already saying for them, in the way that only a very good morning in a very good life can say what does not need words. They were, in the simple and complete sense of the word, home. And they knew it, both of them, in the full and permanent and unhurried way of people who found their way to each other under the particular grace of circumstances that neither of them had planned, through a debt and a deed, and a morning ride to a fence line in the spring of 1882, and who had been building toward this morning, and every morning after ever since. The cottonwoods along the ridge were coming into their spring green, pale and bright against the blue of the sky, the same trees Bessie had seen from the ridge on the morning she first rode down to this ranch with her carpetbag and her $430 and her chin in the air, 4 years ago now, in a different life and the same life, before everything and the beginning of everything all at once. Harvey squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. They went inside to breakfast.